The fabric on the wings is doped cotton, stretched over spruce and steel tubing, and if you press it too hard with a fingertip, it dents. That's what a Piper L-4 is made of. Rosie the Rocketeer hangs in a museum today, restored. 6 bazooka tubes bolted 3 per side to her wing struts, and the whole airframe empty, weighs about 740 pounds. A single machine gun burst would turn her into confetti. She had no armor, no gun sight worth the name, and a top speed a fast car could match on a good road. And in the summer of 1944, over France, this cloth toy killed German tanks. Look at her, and the math refuses to add up. A tank crew inside a Panzer sat behind 80 millimeters of frontal steel, protected by a doctrine that said aircraft were the business of the Luftwaffe and the flak gunners, not something you worried about while you worried about the Shermans in front of you. The threat came from above only in the form of fighter bombers, fast, screaming, gone in 3 seconds. Nobody briefed a tank commander on the little spotter plane that puttered overhead all day, because the little spotter plane was a nuisance, a set of eyes, a thing that called down artillery, but could not itself hurt you. Most versions of this flatten into a cute anecdote and stop there. So if you want the one with the documents and the German side of it, subscribe now, hit that like button, and drop a comment with what you already thought you knew about Bazooka Charlie, because half of what circulates online is wrong. This channel is built on one idea. The best proof of what America built is the face of the enemy who ran into it and couldn't explain it. And there is no better example of that face than a Panzer crew, buttoned up in a hedgerow, hearing an explosion come from a direction their entire training told them was safe. The man flying her was Major Charles Carpenter, a school teacher from Illinois, and I'll get to him. Start with the machine, because the machine is the joke that turns out to be serious. The M6 bazooka rocket carried a shape-charge warhead that could punch through roughly 3 to 4 inches of armor at the right angle, not the front glacis of a heavy tank, but the thin roof, the engine deck, the rear plates where the steel dropped to an inch or less. Carpenter's insight was geometry. A fighter bomber attacks flat and fast and slams its rockets into whatever it can hit. A Piper Cub crawls at 65 miles an hour and can tip its nose down at a tank from almost directly above, aiming at the one part of the machine the designers assumed nobody could reach. He wasn't outflying anyone. He was cheating the angle. The Germans who survived his attacks left a fingerprint in the records, and it's an odd one. A tank knocked out from above penetrated through the top of the turret or the engine grating, with no fighter bomber reported in the sector and no artillery bracket walking in. That's a puzzle for whoever writes the loss report. American after-action accounts credit Carpenter with several tanks and a number of other vehicles across that summer, including armored cars and half-tracks, and while the exact tally is argued over to this day, the records conflict and some claims can't be confirmed. The pattern behind them is not in dispute. Something small and slow was killing armor from a direction that wasn't supposed to hold a weapon. A German gunner scanning his arc for the flat approach of a jawbow would never think to look at the toy circling lazily at 1,500 feet, and that failure to look is the whole story. There's a line that reporters hung on Carpenter that summer, and it survives because it's exactly the wrong thing for a mild schoolteacher to say. Asked about his methods, he described his philosophy of war in 4 words: fire and fall back. He wasn't a warrior by temperament. He taught history to teenagers and would go back to teaching it, and yet a correspondent for the Associated Press watched him work and called him a one-man Air Force, and the nickname Bazooka. Charlie stuck to him for the rest of a life the doctors kept trying to cut short. Hold that quote. It matters later, when we get to what the Army thought a spotter pilot was allowed to do, and what Carpenter did instead. Now stand a German tank commander in the middle of it. You are in a Panzer in the bocage, engine ticking, the crew sweating in the steel box, and the danger you are trained to fear is horizontal. The anti-tank gun in the hedge, the Sherman around the corner, the fighter-bomber in its dive. The one machine you have written off entirely, the flimsy observation plane the Americans use like a pair of binoculars, drops its nose, and something comes through your roof. There is no dive scream to warn you. There is a small engine, an angle nobody covered, and then the inside of your tank is on fire. That collision between what the enemy believed was possible and what a doped cotton airplane actually did to him is where this story lives, and it started with a school teacher who thought the rules were wrong. Charles Carpenter taught history to teenagers in Moline, Illinois, and by every account, he was good at it and content doing it. He was 31 when the war reached him, married, a daughter at home, the kind of man draft boards process by the thousand without a second glance. What the Army saw on paper was a school teacher, and school teachers make good instructors, good clerks, good spotters, men you put somewhere useful and safe. What the Army got was something it had no box for. He wanted armor. He asked for it, more than once, and the record shows the Army did the sensible thing and pointed him at a Piper Cub. Field artillery needed eyes in the air more than it needed one more middle-aged lieutenant in a tank. And observation flying was where a man his age with quick perception belonged. So they trained him to circle a battlefield at 1,500 feet, read the ground, and talk gunners onto targets over the radio. It was vital work, though by design, it was the work of a man who watches other men fight. That distinction mattered to Carpenter in a way it did not matter to the Army. And here's where the mild schoolteacher gets interesting. He had picked up the reason he was over there, and he stated it in a sentence a reporter wrote down and never let go of. "It seems to me," he said, "that if we're going to win this war, a lot of us are going to have to get out and do more than we're doing now." That sentence is not a war cry. It's a history teacher's conclusion, arrived at the way he'd reasoned through a cause of the Civil War for a classroom, and then acted on with a stubbornness nobody in his chain of command expected. The plane he was handed did nothing to encourage a fighting spirit. An L-4 Grasshopper, the military Piper, had a 65-horsepower engine, a fuel load measured in a few dozen minutes of loiter, and a roll that ended at the radio call. The doctrine was explicit. An observation pilot found targets for the guns. He did not become the gun. There was no armament fitted, no provision for any, and no officer above him imagining that the little liaison ship needed teeth. The whole point of the aircraft was that it was cheap, unarmed eyes, a flying pair of binoculars, exactly as a German tanker would have dismissed it. Carpenter looked at that arrangement and disagreed with it. Not loudly, not with a memo up the chain requesting permission, because permission was the one thing he was never going to get. He'd flown enough to understand what his slow, high-perched airplane could do that a fighter-bomber couldn't: hang over a target, study it, and drop its nose at an angle no fast mover could hold. The bazooka was the crudest anti-tank weapon in the American inventory. A stovepipe an infantryman fired off his shoulder, and it was lying around every unit in Normandy. He got hold of the tubes and the mounts, and he bolted them to the wing struts of an aircraft the manufacturer certified for none of it. The mechanics who helped him rig Rosie the Rocketeer were freelancing as much as he was. There was no technical order for wiring 6 M6 rockets to a Piper's electrical system, no engineering study on whether the backblast or the recoil would tear the fabric or unbalance the airframe. The struts were spruce and steel tubing, the same delicate structure that dented under a thumb, and now they carried 3 loaded rocket tubes per side. Nobody signed off on it, because there was no one whose job it was to sign off on something this far outside the manual. Carpenter tested it the only way available, which was to fly it and fire it and see whether the plane came apart. It didn't. What he'd built was a contradiction the Germans would meet without ever getting a briefing on it. The doctrine on both sides agreed on one thing. The observation plane was harmless. American doctrine said so by giving it no weapons. German doctrine said so by not training tank crews to fear it. 2 enemies, 2 general staffs, 1 shared assumption, and a history teacher from Moline quietly voided it with a screwdriver and a stack of infantry rockets. The Army would spend the following weeks unsure whether to court-martial him or decorate him, which tells you exactly how far off the map he'd gone. Understand what kind of man does this, because it isn't the kind you'd guess. Carpenter was not reckless in the daredevil sense. He was methodical, the way a good teacher is methodical. And everything he did to that airplane followed from a single problem he defined and refused to leave alone. The tanks were there. He could reach them, and the rules said he shouldn't. He solved the problem the way he'd solve any problem, with the tools in front of him, and the tool in front of him was a doped cotton airplane and a shoulder-fired rocket never meant to leave the ground. He climbed into it over the Normandy hedgerows, found his first Panzer, and tipped the nose down. What happened next is what put the name Bazooka Charlie into the German loss reports. The radio call went out, the coordinates were good, and Carpenter watched the shells land on the Panzer minutes later than the Panzer deserved. That was the job, and it worked, and it was maddening. He'd found the target himself, watched it through his own eyes, held it in his sight for as long as the fuel lasted, and then handed it to gunners a mile back who couldn't see it at all. By the time the first bracket walked in, the tank had often moved. A moving target in the bocage was a smear of exhaust behind a hedgerow, and the guns chased smears all summer. The loiter is what broke him. A fighter-bomber pilot saw a tank for the length of a dive, 3 or 4 seconds of blurred ground, and then he was gone and thinking about the flak. Carpenter saw the same tank for minutes. He circled it. He watched the commander stand in the hatch, saw the crew brew coffee on the engine deck, and followed a column that halted and refueled, while he read off grid squares to men who had arrived too late to matter. The observation pilot's curse was time. He had all of it, and none of the means to use it. He was close enough to count the road wheels, and forbidden by his own equipment to do a single thing about them. There's a particular kind of frustration in being handed perfect information and no power to act on it, and the artillery pilots of Normandy lived inside it. The Grasshopper had no gun, because the doctrine said the gun was somebody else's job, and the doctrine was efficient and correct and completely infuriating from 1,500 feet. Carpenter would radio a target, request fire, and wait through the whole clumsy relay. His call to the Fire Direction Center, the center's math, the battery's laying, the flight time of the shell, while the thing he was looking at simply drove away. Some days the guns were busy on another mission, and the answer that came back was no. He'd circle a live Panzer, watch it turn onto a road full of American infantry, and be told the tubes were committed elsewhere. Then he'd fly home with the target still alive and the memory of it stuck in his teeth. He was also, the whole time, a target himself, and this is the part the cute anecdote skips. An unarmed L-4 over the front was a slow, low, defenseless thing in the sky. German flak crews shot at grasshoppers as a matter of routine, and the small arms fire from a hedgerow could reach him at the altitudes he needed for good observation. He had no armor to stop any of it, and no weapon to answer with. His only defenses were the plain slowness, which let him turn inside things, and the ground itself, which he learned to hide behind. Dropping below tree lines and popping up somewhere, the gunners weren't pointed. Fire and fall back. The phrase started here, before he had anything to fire. It was already his flying, hitting the deck and running the moment a target noticed him. He was living the fall back and hating the missing half of the sentence. Look at the arithmetic of it. He had the eyes, the time over target, the angle no fighter could hold, the enemy sitting still beneath him with his thin roof exposed to the sky, every element of a kill except the one that killed. The bazooka rocket needed 3 or 4 inches of penetration, and the roof gave it maybe an inch of steel to beat. The geometry was already solved. A plane that could hang overhead and tip its nose straight down was aiming at exactly the plate the tank's designers had left thin because they assumed nobody could reach it. Carpenter, circling, could reach it with his gaze a dozen times a day and touch it with nothing. Every pass was a rehearsal for an attack he wasn't allowed to make. I think this is where the school teacher's mind did the thing school teachers' minds do, which is refuse a contradiction that everyone else had agreed to live with. The Army had built a beautiful division of labor. The eyes fly, the guns shoot, the two talk by radio. It was rational. It was also throwing away the best shot on the field, because that shot happened to be sitting in the observation plane. And the observation plane was defined as a thing that does not shoot. Carpenter had watched enough tanks escape the slow relay to conclude the doctrine was leaving kills on the table, and he was the man in the seat, watching them get away. Nobody above him felt that frustration at 1,500 feet. He felt it every single sortie. So he stopped waiting for the guns. The bazookas were lying around every unit in Normandy. Unglamorous stovepipes and infantrymen fired off his shoulder, and he had the one platform in the theater that could carry them to the one place they'd work. He bolted the tubes to the struts, wired them to a switch in the cockpit, and turned the flying pair of binoculars into the thing it had been forbidden to be. The next time he found a Panzer sitting still beneath him, he did not reach for the radio. He rolled the nose down and closed the distance himself. 6 rounds, Carpenter said of his loadout, and I try to make everyone count. 3 tubes under each wing, wired to a homemade firing switch he could reach without letting go of the stick, and no manual anywhere that told him what would happen when he pressed it. He'd bench-tested the theory, as far as a man can bench-test a thing bolted to fabric. The rest he'd learned in the air, over a live enemy, at the altitude where the small arms fire started reaching up for him. The first firing was the test that mattered. He rolled the Grasshopper onto its nose, let the airspeed build in a shallow dive no fighter pilot would recognize as an attack, and squeezed. The rocket left the tube with a hiss and a jolt that ran back through the spruce, and the airframe held. Nobody had studied the engineering question, and here was the answer. The struts took it. The fabric took it. The little plane didn't shed a wing. He pulled up, came around, and did it again. Now put yourself under him, because this is the section where the German assumption breaks in real time. A tank crew hears an aircraft and does the math their training gave them. Engine note high and screaming, closing fast. That's a jobbo. Get your head down. It's over in seconds. Engine note low, steady, puttering, circling. That's the spotter. Ignore it. The shells are the problem, and the shells come from the guns. A German tank commander in the Bocage had rehearsed those two categories until they were reflex. The slow one is harmless. The slow one is just eyes. You do not aim a machine gun at a pair of eyes when there's a Sherman somewhere in the next field waiting to put a round through your flank. So the tank sits, and the harmless one drops its nose. There is no warning built into the geometry. A dive bomber announces itself with noise, a sound so specific the Germans had a word for the terror of it. Carpenter's approach made almost none of that. 65 horsepower does not scream. The crew heard a small engine change pitch, maybe, and then a shaped charge came through the engine deck or the turret roof, and the inside of the vehicle filled with fire and metal. The men who lived through that first summer of it filed reports that couldn't reconcile the wound with any weapon they'd been told to expect. Roof penetration, rear deck penetration, no fighter bomber in the sector, no artillery bracket, no anti-tank gun sighted to bear on that spot. Something small was killing armor from the one direction the tank was built to ignore. Look at what the doctrine cost them. The whole edifice of German tank survival in Normandy rested on a threat catalog, and the catalog was good. Anti-tank guns, Shermans, fighter bombers, artillery. Every entry in it had a countermeasure the crew could execute. Button up, angle the hull, use the hedges, watch the sky for the fast movers. The catalog had no entry for the observation plane, because the observation plane, by definition, did not carry a weapon. Carpenter had spent weeks watching that gap from above, and now he flew straight through it, and the reflex that kept a crew safe against everything real became the reflex that got them killed. Ignoring him was the correct call, and it stayed correct until the moment it wasn't. The kills accumulated across the summer of 1944, and the count is where the honest version has to slow down. American after-action accounts and the reporting around him credit Carpenter with a string of tanks and other vehicles, armored cars, half-tracks, a scattering of soft targets, and the numbers that circulate range wider than any single document can carry. Some tallies say a handful of Panzers, some push higher, and the German loss reports that would confirm each one don't survive in a form you can lay next to his claims and match. The records conflict. What's not in dispute is that a Piper Cub with rockets on the struts was, by the testimony of the men who armed it and the men who flew alongside it, punching holes in German armor that no Piper Cub had any business punching. He worked the angle every time. Coming from a slice the tank's arc wasn't covering. Hold the dive long enough to aim. actually aim, the thing a fighter bomber never had time to do, and put the rocket into the roof or the rear. The bazooka warhead that bounced off 80 millimeters of glacis went straight through an inch of deck plate. Carpenter wasn't defeating the tank's armor. He was declining to meet it, arriving at the one surface the designers had thinned out because they'd run the same reasoning the German crews had. Nobody can shoot you from directly above with a weapon that light. Somebody could. He'd found the man, the plane, and the angle, and bolted them together with a screwdriver. The Associated Press correspondent who watched him fly came away with the phrase that stuck, "one-man Air Force," and it reads like hype until you sit with what it describes. One aircraft, one pilot, 6 rockets, no support, no permission, doing to German columns what a squadron was supposed to do. Word of it started moving up the chain, and that was the moment the Army had to decide what to do with a spotter who turned himself into a tank destroyer without asking. September 19th, 1944. The 4th Armored Division was strung out around Arracourt in eastern France, and the German 5th Panzer Army had just thrown 2 fresh Panzer brigades at it in a fog that grounded the fighter bombers for most of the morning. That fog is the whole point of what happened next. With the fast movers blind, the one American aircraft that could still work the battlefield was the slow one nobody had authorized to fight. Carpenter took Rosie up under a ceiling that would have kept any sane pilot on the ground. He found a column of German armor moving on the 4th Armored's flank, and the accounts from that day, his own and the men on the ground who watched it, describe him diving into it again and again, rearming on the field and going back. This is the sortie, where the numbers stop being a claim in a newspaper and start being a battle other men saw. He is credited at Arracourt with multiple tanks in a single day's flying, including armor his rockets had no textbook business defeating, and at least one pass that put rockets into 2 vehicles in one run. 2 tanks in one dive. A schoolteacher in a doped cotton airplane over a Panzer brigade doing that. Strip the romance off the dive and look at what it actually was. He nosed the Grasshopper over from a few hundred feet, held it in the shallow plunge long enough for the sight picture to settle, and thumbed the switch at a range where a miss meant flying through his own backblast into the tank's engine deck. The rocket left with that hiss and jolt back through the spruce. The warhead crossed the gap in under a second, and a shaped-charged jet punched through the roof plate and sprayed molten metal into the crew compartment. Then he hauled back on the stick, fabric groaning, 65 horsepower clawing for altitude, while Machine Gun Tracer came up looking for the little plane that had no right to be attacking anyone. He did it, by the day's accounting, until the rockets were gone. Then he landed, had 6 more bolted on, and lifted off into the same fog. The Tiger is where I have to slow down and be honest with you. The Arracourt fighting is usually associated with Panthers. The 5th and 11th Panzer brigades were built around them, and some retellings of Carpenter's day upgrade every kill to a Tiger because Tiger is the word that carries weight. The German armor he hit that autumn included Panthers and the lighter vehicles that traveled with them. And whether a true Tiger sat among his specific victims that day is not something the surviving paperwork lets me pin down. The records conflict. What doesn't change with the model is the geometry. Panther, Tiger, Panzer IV. The roof was thin on all of them, 16 to 40 millimeters, where the front glacis ran 80 or 100, and a bazooka rocket coming straight down did not care which cat it was killing. He was hitting the one plate every German tank shared, and every German tank left weak. Now the admission this whole channel exists to show you. The German crews at Arracourt were not amateurs. 5th Panzer Army was fielding experienced men, and their doctrine for surviving Allied air was mature and drilled. Watch for the jabot, disperse, use terrain, don't bunch on the roads. None of it had a line for the thing killing them, and you can hear the confusion working its way into how they described the air over that front. German soldiers in Normandy, and after spoke of the Allied sky as something total and inescapable, and the phrase that survives from that summer of frontline talk is the flat conviction that anything that moves drew fire from above. That was the ordinary terror of the fighter-bomber. Layer onto it a killer that made no scream, that loitered like a harmless spotter, and then reached down and opened a tank from the top, and you have men who no longer trusted their own ears to tell them what was dangerous. The category that kept them alive, slow means safe, was dead, and they had no replacement for it. There's a colder way the Germans put the whole problem, recorded after the war by their own generals for the Americans. The Allies fought with material, and no plan, however clever, survived the sheer weight and reach of what came at them from the American side. Carpenter is a small entry in that ledger, and a perfect one. He wasn't material in the mass production sense. He was one man improvising. But he was only possible because the American way of war handed a field artillery lieutenant an airplane, spare rockets in every supply dump, and mechanics idle enough to help him rig a weapon nobody ordered. The abundance built the opening. The school teacher walked through it. Listen to the field on that September day, because the sound is the story. Under the fog, no jabot engines, no artillery bracket walking in, and then the small motor overhead changing pitch, the hiss of a rocket, the flat crack of a shaped charge finding roof armor, and a panther burning in a hedgerow, with its crew unable to say where the shot came from. Carpenter climbing away in a plane you could dent with your thumb, coming around for the second tank. By nightfall, the fog had cost the Germans a battle, and part of the bill was written by an aircraft their doctrine still insisted could not fight. Eastern France, the autumn of 1944, and 3rd Army headquarters had a problem it liked. A field artillery lieutenant was flying an unarmed observation plane as a tank destroyer, and the paperwork had no box for that. George Patton ran an army that rewarded exactly this kind of insubordination, the initiative that broke a rule to win a fight, and word of the Piper Cub with rockets on its struts reached a commander built to appreciate it. The story around Carpenter has Patton wanting to meet him, wanting the man in his command, and while the surviving records don't hand me a transcript of that conversation, they don't need to. The Silver Star citation does the talking. They pinned it on him for Arracourt. Read the citation, and it describes a man doing artillery observation who, finding German armor, attacked it with rockets fixed to his aircraft and pressed the attack through enemy fire. The army that spent the whole Normandy summer insisting the observation plane does not shoot wrote a medal for the observation plane shooting. That's the institution admitting, in its own dry ordnance and citation language, that the school teacher had been right, and the doctrine had been leaving kills on the table. He'd broken the division of labor section by section, and instead of a court-martial, he got the Silver Star, and later the Air Medal, and a nickname that traveled ahead of him. The press did the rest. Bazooka Charlie ran in the papers back home, the one-man Air Force from Moline, and the number attached to his name settled into a range that never fully closed. 6 tanks, 14 tanks, somewhere in between, plus the armored cars and half-tracks and trucks that nobody bothered counting with the same care. Look at the range itself, because the range is the honest answer. Confirmed armor kills in that war required a wreck, a witness, sometimes a photograph, and a bureaucracy with time to match a claim to a hull. And Carpenter was flying a machine the confirmation system was never designed to credit. The low number is what the paperwork will swear to. The high number is what the men who flew and fought beside him believed they watched him do. The truth sits in the gap, and the gap is where the records go quiet. What closes it for me isn't the medal, it's the enemy. The German tank crews at Arracourt filed the wounds they couldn't explain, roof penetrations with no fighter bomber overhead, and a threat their doctrine had no name for. That confusion is the confirmation. You cannot fake in a frightened crew's account of what killed the vehicle next to them. The specific signature of a shaped charge coming straight down from a direction they'd been trained to treat as empty. The German catalog of dangers, anti-tank guns, Shermans, Jabos, artillery, had been assembled by professionals who missed nothing that carried a real weapon. Carpenter registered on that catalog anyway, as a hole in it, as the thing that killed from the harmless quarter. When your enemy's own record shows him dying to a weapon he refuses to believe exists, the low estimate stops mattering. The man was doing it. The Germans are the witnesses, and their bewilderment is worth more than any tally sheet Third Army could have typed. Sit with the sound of it one more time, because this is where the whole thing lands. A Panzer crew in the fog outside Arracourt has done everything right. Buttoned up, dispersed, off the open road, ears tuned for the scream that means the fast movers found them. There is no scream. There is a small engine somewhere above, puttering, the sound of a spotter, of nothing to fear, the sound their training filed under ignore. It changes pitch, a hiss they've never been taught to hear, a half-second of nothing. And then, the flat, hard crack of a warhead opening the roof, and the inside of the tank becomes fire, and jetting metal and the smell of it, and the surviving crewman who scrambles out into the wet field, looks up for the aircraft that did this, and sees a doped cotton airplane he could have knocked down with a rifle, climbing away on 65 horsepower, turning to come back. That's the collision this whole story lives inside. The most professional tank army in the world, undone at the one plate it left thin, by the one aircraft it refused to shoot at. Carpenter didn't stay a soldier long past the war. He went back to Moline, back to the history classroom, back to teaching teenagers the past he'd just helped rearrange, and he did it while sick. Hodgkin's disease had been found in him during the fighting, and he taught on through it. He died in 1966, 44 years old, in Urbana, Illinois. There were no further campaigns, no memoir empire, no second act. A history teacher who spent 1 year proving that a rule everyone agreed to obey was wrong, then went home and graded papers. The plane outlasted the man. Rosie the Rocketer, the L-4 Grasshopper with the bracket scars on her struts, was tracked down decades later, restored, and hung where people could stand under her and disbelieve the story all over again. Stand beneath that wing and press the fabric gently, and it still gives under your fingertip. That's the material a schoolteacher flew into a Panzer brigade. The Germans were right, that nothing that light should have been able to touch them. They were just wrong about the man flying it. Carol Carpenter spent years hauling her father's war out of shoeboxes and manila folders, and she did it because the skeptics kept circling the story like it was too good to be sourced. She was a girl in Moline when he came home, and she grew up with a man who didn't talk the way legends are supposed to talk about themselves. When people started calling Bazooka Charlie a tall tale, a wartime press invention, a school teacher's fish story that got fatter with every retelling, she went to the paper, letters he'd written from the front, the AP dispatches, Yank magazine, which put him on its cover in the winter of 1944, with the rockets right there on the struts. Photographs of Rosie loaded and flying, the citations in the Army's own flat language. The documents did what documents do. They took the parts of the story that sounded invented and stamped them contemporary, wartime, filed while the man was still alive to be contradicted by anyone who'd flown beside him. Here is what the skeptics always got backward. They treated the newspaper coverage as the reason to doubt him, as if a story this vivid must have been manufactured for morale, a good yarn dressed up for the home front. Run it the other way. The coverage is the corroboration. War correspondents in 1944 were not in the habit of inventing a named lieutenant, a named aircraft, a specific unit, and a specific battle, and then printing it where every soldier in Third Army could call it a lie. The AP man watched him fly. Yank sent a photographer. The Silver Star went through a chain of officers who signed their names to it. You do not get 4 independent paper trails converging on a fiction. You get them converging on a man who was actually doing it, and the volume of the coverage is a measure of how hard the thing was to believe, even while it was happening in front of witnesses. Carol's boxes settled the argument the only way it could be settled, by burying it under primary sources. And the primary source that matters most was never American at all. Go back to the German paper, because that's the witness that can't be accused of propaganda. Third Army had every reason to inflate a hero. The Panzer crews at Arracourt had every reason not to record that they were being killed by an unarmed spotter plane, and they recorded it anyway. The roof penetrations, the wounds from the harmless quarter, the threat their doctrine couldn't name. An enemy does not manufacture evidence of his own humiliation. When the American press and the German loss reports point at the same event from opposite sides of the line, both wanting different things and arriving at the same fact, the skeptic has nowhere left to stand. The legend and the record are the same document, read in 2 languages. Now the reversal, because this is where the geometry turns all the way around. The German tank, by the autumn of 1944, was the most heavily armored fighting vehicle on the Western Front, and every kilogram of that armor was an argument about where death came from. Thick at the front, angled at the glacis, built to survive the anti-tank gun and the Sherman coming at it across a field. The roof stayed thin because the roof faced a threat the designers had reasoned away. Nobody shoots you from straight up with a weapon light enough to be worth ignoring. They built the whole tank around a prediction about the sky, and the prediction had one gap in it, and Carpenter flew a fabric airplane through the gap all summer, The Germans armored themselves against everything except the thing that opened them, and the man who found the gap didn't get to keep his war either. Carpenter came home to the diagnosis that had been growing in him through the fighting, Hodgkin's disease, and it took him at 44, while the tank crews he'd frightened were middle-aged men rebuilding a country. The pilot who beat the Panzer outlived the Third Reich by 21 years and lost to something no armor plate addresses. There's no triumph that stays sealed. The schoolteacher won the argument with German doctrine and then graded papers until the illness finished what the tracer over Arracourt never could. Both sides earned their dignity in this, and neither side got to hold it long. The Panzer men were professionals who did everything their training demanded and died to the one weapon the training forgot. Carpenter was a citizen who read the war better than the war read itself, proved it over a live enemy, and went quietly back to Illinois to teach the subject he'd briefly rewritten. The armor is scrapped now. The teacher is gone. The fabric airplane hangs restored, with the bracket scars still in her struts, and you can stand under her and press the wing and feel how little there was between Carpenter and the guns. The last word belongs to the man himself, from a letter he wrote from France while it was all still happening, and it carries no boast in it. "It's a great life," Carpenter wrote home, "if you don't weaken." He didn't weaken over the Panzers. He weakened only to the thing that comes for everyone, and he met that the way he met the tanks, at the front of a classroom, saying nothing about the medals in a drawer.